Could FDA-approved Vyvgart, efgartigimod alpha FCAB for intravenous infusion, or Vyvgart Hytrulo, efgartigimod alpha and hyaluronidase QVFC for subcutaneous injection help your adult patients? Explore clinical trial data and learn how to get patients started at vyvgarthcp.com. Vyvgart is a registered trademark of argenx. Vyvgart Hytrulo is a trademark of argenx.
This is Jose Merino, Editor-in-Chief of the Neurology family of journals. The Neurology podcast provides practical information to neurologists and other clinicians to help them provide better care for their patients. Thanks for listening and have a great week.
Hey, this is Jason Crowell. Thanks for listening to the Neurology podcast. Today, we're discussing a paper that was published in December 2023 in the journal Neurology. The paper is titled Game-Based Learning in Neuroscience, Key Terminology, Literature Survey, and How-To Guide to Create a Serious Game. Joining us, we have Sarah Edwards. Sarah is an emergency medicine resident in the UK associated with the National Health Service. And we have Zach London, who is a neurologist at the University of Michigan. Sarah, Zach, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us, Jason.
I'm curious how you guys decided to do some research and publish on games in neuroscience and games in neurology. What was the impetus for this? I'm curious.
We are part of a informal gaming group, I guess, which is how Zach and I met, because obviously I'm in the UK and don't work in the US. And essentially our love for games came together by a colleague, Michael Cosimini, in a Slack group called the Gamer Collaborative. And we met through that, really. So all of the authors met that way, using a mix of my experience of sort of gaming and that sort of thing, with the neurology type things that Zach brings. I think that would be about how it worked.
Very good. So before we talk about neuroscience games specifically, it would probably be useful for us to do some definitions. So you spell out some of these things in the paper, but we even have to define game and to gamify a topic or gamification. What do we mean when we're making a game or turning things into a game? How would you describe that?
Well, there are a couple of ways to think about it. And I think the term that you probably hear and that you just used, gamification, is, I think, a term that people probably misuse to some degree. Gamification is really when you take something that is in a non-game setting and you add a game-like element to it, right? So, I think the classic gamification would be like getting badges for doing something or getting reward points or, just a Fitbit counting your steps. Or Neurology, I think about the Question of the Day app, which has leaderboards and streaks and things like that. The thing to realize is that that's not a game. That's just asking you trivia questions, right? But it adds this game-like element to something that otherwise is a different activity, like walking or exercising or buying coffee or studying neurology, write review or CME review questions. So that's what gamification is. Not the same thing as making a game per se. When I think about a game, I think of something that is truly interactive and it can't be sort of separated from the other activity. And that's where we come to this term serious games, which people use to define as games that are really directed primarily at the purpose of education. Ideally, they have actual learning objectives, and they're accomplishing those objectives in a way that's sort of prioritized over fun, I guess. And most importantly, like the educational lesson is really integrated into what we call the core gameplay loop, which is basically what you're doing where you're making choices and getting feedback. And so I think those are sort of opposite ends of the spectrum. Gamification is not a game at all, but adding a game-like element. Serious games are games that are integrated primarily for the purpose of education. And then there's this whole world of games that can educate but aren't really serious games. And I think Sarah and I, we talked about this a lot. We kind of struggled because I think in the literature, people don't really have a word for this. But we've used the term game-based learning to be sort of a superset of all of these things.
Terrific. So, within the world of neurology, we often encounter individuals, and we ourselves experience this neurophobia where it can be dense, difficult to understand material. I've often argued that maybe peripheral neurology should be a separate specialty rather than the regular neurology with your nerves and plexuses, et cetera. But what would you say is the utility of then gamification and game-based learning in the world of neurology and neurosciences?
As the non-neurologist and being an emergency medicine physician, for me, neurology can be quite scary. I mean, common being common, I see strokes, I see bleeds, I see that sort of thing. But actually, true neurology is difficult. I think there are huge numbers of games that we found during this project. Really lucky that Zach has created some of them. And what it does is it breaks down that neurophobia. It makes it a bit less scary, a bit more fun. One of my favorite games to play is called Foramina, and it's cranial nerve themed. It's a tabletop game, and it's so much fun. Like, to know the 12 cranial nerves. I played it for the first time last year, and I'd never come across it. For somebody that has to examine the cranial nerves quite often in my job, it really helped for me to relearn them and reimagine them in a fun way. And I'd be interested to know, like, Zach, what you think, being from, a neurologist and versus me, a non-neurologist.
A lot of things that make games good for education in general, and we could touch on those. But I think if you're specifically asking about neurology and neuroscience, the thing that drives a lot of people away from neurology is sort of the complexity of the anatomy and neuroanatomic localization and sort of understanding tracks and that sort of thing. And I think those things are just perfect for games. I mean, I think when I look at a lot of the games that I like to play are based on maps, right? There's a map of some countryside or of the world, if you play Pandemic or Catan or Carcassonne or some of these other sort of modern games. A lot of them are based on maps, and the whole nervous system is a map, right? I mean, that's one of the things that we like about it is the central nervous system kind of has pathways, the peripheral nervous system has pathways in a map. And so those things are, I think, really ripe for having games made out of them. One of the challenges, of course, is when you're making a game, you want to have material that is sort of timeless. You want people to be able to play the game 5 years from now or even longer and still have the things in it be valid. And of course, in medicine, everything changes all the time. Half of what I learned in medical school isn't true anymore. But that's one of the things that's sort of appealing about anatomy and localization is they haven't changed since Charcot was doing this. And they're hopefully not going to in the next 100 years either.
So in this paper, you do a survey, a literature review of what's been published about neuroscience games, then also provide discussion of the different games that are currently available. What are some of the more common ones that we may have heard of, and how do they work? What do they teach?
I don't know if the ones that are available are really in the common parlance right now, but there are a number of them out there. And I think some of the ones that we touch on that really fall into the category of serious games that are commercially available one way or another. There's a game called Stroke of Genius by Ann Helms, who's one of our co-authors, which is where players have to formulate an evolving story for sort of a stroke syndrome related to cards that they draw that have to do with anatomy and risk factors and pathophysiology. There is a game that's a little bit more basic science oriented called Signal by Angel Carr, which is, I think you have to sort of build a synapse using a deck that has proteins and molecules. And there's a really cool neuroanatomy game by Austin Lim called Neuronavigator, where you're moving around in coronal sections of the brain to try to get to certain neuroanatomic locations faster than other people. Some of the ones that I've been involved with are called The Lesion and The Plexus. Those are both anatomy localization games. The Lesion is about central nervous system. The Plexus is about peripheral nervous system. Sarah mentioned foramina, which is about cranial nerves. So you're kind of getting a sense that a lot of these are anatomy based. And maybe by the time this podcast is finished, I have another one that I'm hoping to have available real soon, which is called Field Cut. And it literally is just about the anatomy of lesions that cause visual field deficits.
In this paper, you guys also do a literature review about what's been published about games and gaming, including in neuroscience. Can you talk about what you found in that review?
We had a brief look at the literature because I think it's really important to understand what's out there, what's published. So we did a systematic search of the literature, and this took us all the way up to March 2023. And from that, we ended up with 2,068 articles, which whittled it all the way down to 13 unique games. Not all of them were named. Some of these were original research, so going off and doing a paper about how the game changed X or Y, and some of them were conference abstracts. So those are the the games that are available. And if you have the opportunity to look at the paper, we list all the games. And then what we did as well, we also had a look at the sort of games that were available sort of commercially. And I think looking at that, that was around 14 available games that commercially you can buy. And these games were not always the same as the games that were published. So there's quite a lot of games available. Some of the games that were published never came more than the conference abstract. And some of the games that are published that are commercially available have never been researched. So I think there's quite a lot of games out there, quite a lot of unique games out there, but not all are available. So I think it's useful to kind of know that.
And I think that makes an important point, Sarah, because I was in a room full of people at a meeting recently, and I asked how many people in the room had ever made a game for education, and half the hands went up, right? So a lot of people are doing this for their own learners. But as far as making games that are sort of more widely available, this is really still a nascent field. There are not very many that are available to the public or commercially available yet. And I think this is a community we're interested in growing. And I think the evidence behind games for education has certainly grown a lot. And so I think that there's an opportunity for creative educators to really make their mark in this area.
And to that end, one of the things you did that I really appreciated was you go through and give how to think about designing a game, which I really felt was fascinating. I'd never given much thought to almost the science or the steps involved in creating a game. Could you share with our listeners how that works?
I think there are 4 overall phases when you're thinking about designing a game. So there's the phase 1, which is your sort of preparation phase. And I think this can be subdivided into thinking about things about, content or domain and what you want to talk about, thinking about your audience and setting. Well, who is it you're doing it for? Is it for your undergraduate neurologists, or is it for your postgraduate doctors? Who's it for? And then thinking about, equity and representativeness in the sense of, are you going to be able to cover something that's realistic? What do you want to cover? So that's sort of your preparation phase. And I think this can be, and often, I don't know about Zach, but when I'm sitting down creating games, there's literally bits of paper, post-it notes, pens, just getting thoughts down on those sheets of paper. So that's phase 1, so your preparation sort of phase.
And I would just interject and say everything that you've said so far is basically defining what you would want to do to create any educational lesson, any curriculum, right? I mean, so this is sort of coming up with the idea of what you want to teach and who you want to teach. And then we start making a game.
Yeah, absolutely. And often preparing for anything that you do, you might get a bit of paper down, you might get your iPad out, you might be jotting notes down, thinking about, well, what is it I want to do and what am I setting out to achieve? And then phase 2 is your game design. And that's thinking about determining what the nature of the game is, what your game mechanics might be. So that was phase 1, the preparation phase. And then secondly, I often thinking about phase 2, which is your game design. So thinking about the nature of the game, thinking about, well, what are the game mechanics that might work? So could this be rolling a dice and maybe moving along a board? Could this be like matching cards? Could this be more complex? And then the last thing that I always think about with game design is selecting the best medium. So does it need to be a board game? Does it need to be matching games? Could it just be dice? Could it be digital? So those are some of the things to think about in the game design phase.
Yeah, and I think the key here is when she's talking about mechanics, this is just like not just the rules of a game, but sort of the broader ways that you interact with the game, that players interact and strategize and achieve goals. And it's not something you really think about until you start playing games, that games sort of have a finite number of these mechanics, right? I mean, she mentioned rolling dice. Like, not every game has that, but that's something that's very common. And you'll start to recognize that there are 20 or 30 mechanics that show up in games over and over and over again. Managing hands, restricted communication, card drafting, deck building, push your luck. These are terms that won't mean anything to you until you start playing a lot of games. Then you realize they are coming up over and over and over again. So I would say the secret here is just play a lot of games. Like, go to the library and take home games and figure out what you like, figure out what are sort of the mechanics that give you those moments of excitement, and also figure out what you don't like. What are the games that you find frustrating or boring? And then if you want to make a game, start looking at the mechanics that excite you and think about how you could apply an educational lesson to those.
You've hit the nail on the head there. I think it is play lots of games and just test out what is it you like and work with something that you like and work with something that you're familiar. Keep it simple. I always say in emergency medicine, keep it simple. I think with game design, just start simple. You're not going for really complex, all day playing Dungeons and Dragons style gaming. You want to keep it simple. And then comes phase 3, which is iteration and play testing. So this is about, you've got to start designing something, I guess. And as I said before, you think about create a minimum viable product. So get your Post-it notes out, get your big sheets of paper, get your felt tip pens out, start scrawling, drawing. It doesn't need to be all singing, all dancing. Within it, particularly within topics that you might be picking, make sure that you've got equity, diversity, and inclusivity so that you're not stereotyping particular conditions or peoples or genders or etc. You get the idea. And then the other thing to think about is reviewing and refining, very much like, you would do with a presentation or a teaching thing. Well, how are you going to review it? How are you going to refine it?
And I would suggest also trying it out with different audiences, right? So start with collaborators, people who have been involved with playing a lot of games, then work with people who don't play games, but are sort of the level of learner that you're going for. Because I feel like a lot of times my instinct is to make games that I want to play. And the games that I want to play often have 50-page rule books. And I realize that the people I want to teach are not interested in games with 50-page rule books.
And again, when you're starting this out, going back to each phase, keep it simple. And then get confident with what you're doing. Play something that's familiar, play something that is safe, and then you can go as complex as you want.
And it's okay to use existing games and put a neurology stamp on them because, you can't actually patent a game mechanic. So, for instance, people already know how to play Taboo, so you make a neurology version of Taboo. It's super easy. It's guaranteed to be a hit because you already know that mechanic works. And so if there are games that people already know how to play, like Twister or Jenga or anything, think of some way that you can just turn that into an educational game, and then you won't spend a half an hour explaining the rules to everybody.
Yeah, and lastly, it's the 4th phase, which is sort of implementation and evaluation. So thinking about funding and manufacturing, if that is important to you. It doesn't have to be. It's not the be-all and end-all for everyone. Thinking about marketing and publicising the game, because those probably will go together if you're thinking broadly and wanting to make some money or what have you, or even some return for the time that your department has given you to develop this game. And finally, how could you potentially thinking about future-proofing it? What could be the next steps? Is what you're producing now going to be relevant in 5 years' time or in date 5 years' time? And if it isn't, that's fine, but how are you going to update it?
I find that those steps really helpful. I think the thing that stood out to me the most was understanding this idea of game mechanics and realizing that creating a new game doesn't require creating a new mechanic. And in fact, creating a new mechanic might actually work against you because using one that's already known and available and successful is going to help it succeed because people already know how to play it, so to speak. Well, terrific. Thank you guys so much for that review. Again, I'd encourage you to check out the paper. The title of the paper is Game-Based Learning in Neuroscience, Key Terminology, Literature Survey, and How-To Guide to Create a Serious Game. It was published in the journal Neurology in December 2023. And again, I want to thank Zach London from the University of Michigan and Sarah Edwards from the National Health Service for joining us today. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks again, Jason. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks very much.
This is Stacey Clardy, your podcast editor. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please take a few moments to subscribe, rate, and review the Neurology Podcast through Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And remember, you can always head to neurology.org/podcast for our full list of past episodes. Or you can also search by keyword in your podcast app for any neurology-specific topics you want to learn about.